The term achievement gap is commonly used to describe the differences between white students and black students within the American education system. This term is completely applicable as well to the statistical evidence of the success rates of Alaska Native students in Alaska. From the early days of colonization, Alaska Natives have experienced overt and covert pressure to assimilate first to Russian culture and then to American culture. The practice of colonization creates an upper class made up of the imperializing group and an underclass of those they are colonizing. In order to keep this underclass in their position, the establishment of inequities in the education system is necessary. This paper looks at the historical and systematic practices that have created these disparities. Traditional education that existed in Native communities prepared children for life within the tribe and the natural environment. Not only was this type of education not valued by the imperial force of the United States, it stood in opposition of the goal of assimilation. The deficit model makes the devaluing of Native education necessary in order to establish the value of Western schooling and culture that the United States hoped to impose on the people of Alaska. Sheldon Jackson, as General Agent of Education in Alaska, guided the first attempts of a territorial education. Jackson, while seemingly progressive in his advocacy for education for Native children, promoted a policy of acculturation. This accepted policy is articulated by Berriman. An important phase of acculturation has been the rejection of traditional culture and adoption of alien culture models derived from the dominant group. This assumes the subjugated group would be happy to take on the dominant and implied better culture. Berriman concludes his paper with the thought that when one group is dominant to the detriment of the way of life of the other group, members of the subordinate group characteristically come to value positively many of the norms of the dominant group. While the statement was made decades ago, the obvious weight of value that the dominant group culture holds in their own estimation further denies the cultural identity of the group being colonized. This continues to impact the experience of Native children in our state school system. Our pronounced key to success in our acknowledged dominant culture is education. The long-term impact of Jackson's determination to separate Native children from their language has been to pull a necessary underpinning from traditional family life and culture. By the turn of the century, the practice of segregation had become established in 20 villages. The separateness of schooling systems was confirmed by different government organizations that would run territorial schools for white students and the federal government in the form of Bureau of Indian Affairs. Village schools for white students would continue through 12th grade. However, schools for Native children stopped at the 8th grade level. In an effort to provide some Native children with further vocational education, the era of the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school system was born in Alaska. The deficit model, evident in the separation of schools as well as in the need only for vocational education for older Native students, continued to undermine the sense of identity and positive self-image necessary for success. Initially, the boarding school system removed children from their homes and villages in Alaska and sent them out of state. When this proved untenable, the Bureau of Indian Affairs opened 3 schools for vocational training in Alaska. In 2005, Diane Hirschberg and Susan Sharp examined this practice and reported their findings in a paper entitled 30 Years Later, the Long-Term Effects of Boarding Schools in Alaska Natives and Their Communities. Hirschberg and Sharp were able to interview over 60 Native Alaskans who had attended boarding schools over a 40-year period. While some participants reported benefits, such as lifelong friendships or relief from abusive homes, as valuable results of the boarding school experience, the overwhelming quotes from the participants in the report are related to the loss of identity, abuse at the hands of school staff, and misuse of alcohol. One participant commented it was a devastation, and I would say that after all these years, I can see a glimmer of hope that our people are coming out of that and starting to realize what boarding schools did to us because we are here. This participant is now a grandparent and goes on to wonder, it takes how many generations for us to begin to heal so that we can live true to ourselves, where we feel whole inside, and be Inupiat and not try to be what we're not, because that's not conducive to harmony within the soul. Hertzberg and Sharp also report that adults recalled children being beaten for using their first languages. Additionally, children were sexually abused. For over 1/3 of the participants in this study, their experience in the boarding school system cost them their cultural knowledge, integral to a strong sense of identity. Carol Barnard notes that during the 1920s and 30s, more than 2/3 of Alaska Native children were attending federal schools were in boarding schools. By mid-century, 93 federal BIA schools and 3 boarding schools remained in Alaska, but 30 to 40 communities and 1,800 children were still without facilities at all. Teacher turnover rates in these schools were high, which further fractured the relationship between the two cultures. Identity does not grow in a vacuum. The abuse, both emotional and physical, that is inherent in denying children their families and culture itself creates problems for those families that the dominant culture can then use to justify their dominance. The blaming of the victim perpetuates the problem and justifies further control and dismissal of the colonized people. The authors note in their conclusion that most of the educators who worked in these boarding schools were implementing what they believed at the time to be in the best interest of the students. And despite our new paradigms of the value of indigenous culture, these educators were working under the best knowledge of the time. This argument is made only by the dominant culture in order to make peace with their past behavior. Not all participants related horror stories of their experiences. Some commented on the benefits of lifelong friendships with other students, educational foundations that allowed for further careers and college experiences. This is testament, however, not to the educators, but to the participants themselves. The justification of the good intentions by those in authority in the boarding school system is another layer of denying the identity of the students who were forced to give up their language, family, and cultures. A number of participants comment on the connection between the loss of being parented during these formative years and being parents. The transfer of family and cultural traditions that was lost over this 40-year period has had a lasting impact on Native cultures, as well as on the view of those cultures by the dominant one. For Native children, this impact is evidenced in poor standardized test scores, high discipline and dropout rates, and eventually high prison rates. In an effort to address educational inequities, a number of Native families challenged the legality of the lack of adequate high schools. Attorney Stephen Cotton worked for over 10 years on what is officially the Tobaluk versus Landmark case. The case is commonly referred to as the Molly Hooch case. Molly Hooch was the first name of the listed 27 plaintiffs. Speaking at a University of Alaska symposium in 2004, Cotton recounts the establishment of the evidence that both the United States and the Alaska constitutions were being violated in this failure to provide educational opportunities for Alaska Native children. At the time of statehood, 34 high schools existed in Alaska. Of the 34, only 6 had population rates of Native students larger than 50%. The denial of access to education for Native students wasn't merely an oversight by the state, as noted by Cotton. And the state didn't just inherit a discriminatory system. The state actively discriminated when it came to providing or not providing high schools in the communities where it ran the educational show. The blatant prejudice that creates disparities, such as 2,500 children without access to a local high school just deposed against only 120 white students in a similar position, creates and encourages failure for Alaska Native students. Cotton's assessment that discrimination is not just an artifact of Alaskan history. It was an ongoing problem that affected decision-making even as the lawsuit was going forward. The families engaged in the Landmark case sought autonomy in the educational system for Native students. From Sheldon Jackson in the 1880s to the Molly Hooch case in the 1970s, America engaged in 100 years of, at best, undervaluing the cultures that lived in Alaska long before it became part of the United States. The Tobaluk versus Lynn verdict, which resulted in a signed consent decree in the fall of 1976, was recognizable in that 42 villages that were able to create high school programs within existing structures in the villages immediately. The geography of Alaska has always made building and maintaining schools in small villages difficult. However, the racism present in the decision-making in terms of use of education as a tool of assimilation and destruction of Alaska Native cultures has had success in creating a Native underclass while holding with the circular logic that justifies racism. Currently, discipline rates for Native children are quite high relative to white students. Nationally, according to a recent Discipline Disparities Research to Practice collaborative report, 1 of every 13 American Indian Alaska Native students were suspended during the 2011-2012 school year. Comparatively, only 1 of 20 white students experiences the same. Disparities in use of school discipline by race, gender, and sexual orientation have been well documented and continue to place large numbers of students at risk for short-term and long-term negative outcomes, the authors report. They go on to note that the field has learned that contextual factors such as higher rates of student misbehavior and higher rates of poverty do not fully explain racial disparities. These contextual factors are ones that have allowed the logical fallacy of blaming the victim. Instead, the report continues, factors that may contribute to the racial diversity of the student body and the faculty, classroom administrative decision-making processes, and the differential experiences and perceptions of school culture. Furthermore, data collected in the Alaska and Pacific Northwest by Civil Rights Project of UCLA's Graduate School of Education Information Studies reveal that less than 50% of Alaska Native and American Indian students in this region graduate from high school. According to the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services Division of Juvenile Justice, Alaska Native children make up 37% of the juvenile justice system. While this percentage is equal to that of white children, the United States Census Bureau reports that whites make up 67% of the Alaskan population, and the Alaska Native only and mixed race populations together only total 21%. The rates of young Native people in the justice system stays consistent into adulthood. The Alaska Justice Forum reports that 37% of the adult prison population is Alaska Native. These numbers, taken within the context of historical mindsets regarding Alaska Natives, demonstrate the deficit model, which in itself creates deficits. Attempts have been made to understand the value of culture within the context of learning, and towards that end, many schools in the Fairbanks-North Star Borough have an Alaska Native education staff member. Additionally, Jerry Lipka and Teresa McCarthy studied programs in Arizona and Alaska that sought to use indigenous teacher groups as resources for curricular development. Lipka and McCarthy document the low numbers of Alaska Native teachers, only 3%, while recounting the process of creating valuable cultural approaches to education that make use of community and traditional knowledge as valuable tools in a process that would eventually be quantified in increased standardized test scores. By recognizing the value of Native teachers in the classroom and in the development of curriculum, we can begin to change the deficit model. In my own work as cultural liaison at North Pole High School, I work with both individual students and in classrooms to address our school climate. Each semester for over 4 years, I've been invited to guide a lesson regarding the civil rights work of Elizabeth Peratrovich for the connection toward examining our students' ideas about race in school. Invariably, white students' view and understanding of all Native cultures is based only on negative stereotypes. At North Pole High School, our total population is over 730 students, only 23 are Native. Native students are isolated in classrooms where, based on white student self-reporting, racial slurs are used openly. While these students do not face the harshness and abuse that was part of the earlier public school system, they continue to attempt to find footing in a dominant culture that diminishes their humanity. Recently, I was asked to speak in an advanced placement class that had just read the Lorraine Hansberry play A Raisin in the Sun. I directed my talk toward housing inequalities and weaved statistical information about Native Alaskan racism as well. The teacher, in an attempt to be supportive, pointed out the accomplishments of our one Native faculty member. You guys know Miss W. She's educated, so is her whole family, but she still experiences racism. I turned to the class and asked them, 8 white girls and 2 white boys, no racial diversity at all, if they thought someone had to be a good Native to be taken seriously or treated with respect. The underpinning of the deficit model demonstrated by this teacher, who calls herself a friend of one of our Native